My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 29 years old. 2 weeks before my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner, my mother called to tell me I wasn't on the guest list. Not because of a venue headcount, not because of some logistical mix-up, because Claire had decided that having an electrician at the table with Daniel Hartwell's family would make the wrong kind of impression. "You work with your hands," my mother said. Like that explained everything. These are people who lunch at the Four Seasons. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was what I carried in a manila folder in the fireproof safe bolted under my workbench. And 5 days after that rehearsal dinner, my mother called me again. Only this time her voice was shaking so badly I almost didn't recognize it. Daniel Hartwell, it turned out, had done his homework. And everything Claire had built her future on was starting to come apart at the seams. Before we go any further, if this story hits close to home, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. Drop your city and the time where you are in the comments if you've ever been the family member someone tried to hide. Now let me tell you how it all started. I'd been a licensed electrician for 6 years, working commercial and residential out of Portland, Oregon. My hands were calloused and my boots were steel-toed, and I drove a white work van with the name of my one-woman operation stenciled on the side, Mitchell Electric. I made decent money. Not wealthy, but comfortable. Paid my rent on time. Had a savings account with real numbers in it. Kept a reliable used truck for personal driving. I liked my work. There was something satisfying about tracing a dead circuit back to its source, finding the break, restoring the power. People called me when things stopped working. I fixed them. I went home. My sister Claire would describe my life as sweet, the way people describe a studio apartment with no natural light. Claire was 33, 4 years older than me, and she had dedicated the better part of a decade to becoming the kind of woman who got photographed at charity events. She worked in marketing for a luxury skincare brand, which mostly meant she attended parties and called it networking. She was beautiful, polished, and deeply obsessed with what other people thought of her. We'd never been close, not really, but we'd maintained a cordial distance. Birthday texts, Christmas dinners, the occasional phone call that lasted exactly as long as social obligation required. Then she met Daniel Hartwell. Daniel came from old Portland money, the kind that showed up in building names and hospital wings. His family owned a commercial real estate development firm that had been quietly reshaping the city's skyline for 3 generations. He was 41, distinguished in that silver-templed way that impresses certain people, and he was clearly very serious about Claire. By their 5th month of dating, she was already talking about the wedding like it was a business strategy. The venue, the photographer, the guest list. All of it had to reflect a certain image. The image, apparently, did not include me. Our parents had always treated Claire and me differently, but they'd at least pretended otherwise until Daniel came along and gave them a reason to stop pretending. My mother started referring to Claire's life as the family's future, as though I were a footnote from a rougher draft. My father, who had spent 30 years as a mid-level insurance adjuster and never once apologized for it, began talking about presentation and the kind of people worth knowing. He stopped asking about my work, the way you stop mentioning someone's name when you've decided they've become inconvenient. The hierarchy had always been there, just quieter. Growing up, Claire's dance recitals got the camcorder. My shop class projects got left on the porch. Claire's college acceptance letter went on the refrigerator. My electrician certification went into a drawer, and my father said, almost gently, that maybe I'd find something more suited to my potential someday. I was 23 and already better at my job than most of the men I'd trained alongside. I let it go. I always let it go. What they never talked about was our grandfather, Raymond Earl Mitchell. Grandpa Ray had died 14 months before Claire's engagement. Quietly, in the house he built himself in the hills outside of town. He'd spent his life as a contractor, then a property manager. Then, and this was the part nobody in my family had ever fully understood, something else entirely. He and I had been close since I was small. He was the one who put a flashlight in my hand at age 7 and showed me how the wiring in an old lamp worked. He was the one who came to my certification ceremony when my parents had a prior commitment at one of Claire's events. In his final 2 years, when his health declined and his world got smaller, I visited every Sunday. I brought food, fixed things around the house, sat with him while he watched baseball. The rest of the family visited when it was convenient. 3 weeks before he died, Grandpa Ray asked me to sit with him at the kitchen table. He pushed a sealed envelope across the wood toward me and told me not to open it until after the estate attorney contacted me. He said there were things about his financial life that the family had never understood and that he'd decided after a great deal of thought, he trusted me to handle them correctly. He said he chose me not because I was the most educated or the most ambitious, but because I was the one who showed up. People who show up, he told me, understand that things need tending. The ones who only appear when there's something to gain. They've already told you everything you need to know about them. I cried in my van on the way home. After the funeral, after the family had finished performing their grief and gone back to their routines, an attorney named Gerald Park called me. He explained that Raymond Earl Mitchell had not, in fact, spent his life accumulating modest savings and a modest property portfolio. He had spent 40 years quietly acquiring, maintaining, and appreciating a collection of commercial and residential properties in and around Portland, some held personally, some through an LLC called Ridgeline Holdings. The total estimated value at current market appraisal was just over $8.7 million. I was named as sole executor of the estate and majority stakeholder of the estate and majority stakeholder, 62% in Ridgeline Holdings. The remaining 38% was split among the rest of the family. There was a provision in the trust document that Gerald Park read to me twice, slowly, to make sure I understood it. Any beneficiary who engaged in conduct that publicly disparaged another beneficiary on the basis of occupation, income, or social class would trigger a forfeiture clause, their share transferring to the estate's charitable endowment, a fund Grandpa Ray had set up years earlier to provide vocational training scholarships for young people in Oregon. He'd written the provision himself, in plain language, because he'd watched the way my family talked about tradeswork his entire life and he was tired of it. I told almost no one. My closest friend knew. Gerald Park knew. My grandfather's old business partner, a quiet man named Walt Deering, knew. I kept working. I kept showing up to jobs. I let the silence do what silence does. Then Claire announced her engagement, and the machine started up. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in the Pearl District that charged $40 for a bowl of pasta. Claire's future in-laws were flying in from Boston. There would be 22 people at the table, a rehearsed seating arrangement, and a photographer for the kind of candid shots that aren't actually candid. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon and explained with the tone of someone delivering difficult but necessary news that Claire had asked her to reach out. The decision had been made. My name wasn't on the reservation. You know how she gets about appearances, my mother said. Daniel's mother asked about the guest list, and Claire she didn't want to have to explain what you do. It's nothing personal, sweetheart. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about what Grandpa Ray had said about people who only appear when there's something to gain. I understand, I said, and I meant it in a different way than she thought. I spent that Friday evening the way I spent most Friday evenings, on my couch with takeout Thai food and a home improvement show I'd seen 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone to vent. I thought about Grandpa Ray and I thought about the folder in the safe and I thought about the fact that among the properties listed in Ridgeline Holdings was a mixed-use commercial building in the South Park blocks, 6 stories, 12 commercial tenants, appraised at $2.1 million. I thought about that building because I had recently received a letter of interest from a development firm inquiring about its potential acquisition. The firm was called Hartwell Property Group. I hadn't responded yet. I'd been deciding how to proceed. The rehearsal dinner happened without me. My mother sent a text the next morning with a photo of the table, flowers, candlelight, everyone smiling in the way people smile when they know they're being photographed. Claire looked radiant. Daniel looked like the kind of man who had always expected to look like that in photographs. I saved the photo to a folder on my phone labeled Nothing. What I found out later, through a sequence of events that I did not engineer but did not interfere with, was what happened when Daniel Hartwell mentioned the South Park Blocks building to his acquisition team. and they traced the holding company back to its majority stakeholder, his attorney called Gerald Park. Gerald Park, per the instructions I had given him 6 months earlier, confirmed that Ridgeline Holdings was active and that any acquisition inquiries should be directed to the majority stakeholder directly. He provided my contact information, my name, my number, Mitchell Electric, Portland, Oregon. Daniel Hartwell is not a stupid man. He did what any thorough businessman would do. He searched my name. He found my business license, my contractor's registration, my LinkedIn page with its matter-of-fact summary, licensed master electrician, sole proprietor, 6 years commercial and residential. He found my connection to Raymond Earl Mitchell in the public records of the Ridgeline Holdings LLC filing. He put it together. My phone rang on a Wednesday evening, 5 days after the rehearsal dinner. I was reorganizing a panel box on a job site in Northwest Portland when I saw the number. Gerald had already texted to give me a heads up. I finished what I was doing, wiped my hands on my work pants, and answered. Daniel Hartwell introduced himself politely, professionally, with the careful warmth of someone who has spent a career making people feel at ease before negotiating with them. He said he understood I was Raymond Mitchell's granddaughter. He said he had a great deal of respect for the portfolio that had been assembled. He said he hoped we might meet to discuss the South Park Blocks property. I said I was available Thursday afternoon. There was a pause. I imagined him recalibrating something. I'd like to mention, he said carefully, that I believe we may be connected through family, so to speak. I'm engaged to Claire Mitchell. I know, I said. I'm her sister. I'll see you Thursday. I went back to the panel box. I want to be clear that I did not go into that meeting looking for revenge. What I wanted was straightforward. A fair negotiation, conducted professionally, with someone who now understood that the woman he and his fiancée had considered too embarrassing to seat at a dinner table was also the person whose signature he needed on a multi-million-dollar acquisition. I wasn't angry in the way that makes people do reckless things. I was something quieter than that. I was finished pretending that the way my family saw me was the correct way to see me. We met at Gerald's office, which was intentional. Daniel arrived in a charcoal suit with his firm's acquisition director. He was composed, but there was something careful in his eyes when he shook my hand, a recalibration happening in real time. I was in clean clothes, not work clothes, but I hadn't dressed up. I was myself. I've always been most comfortable being exactly that. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Daniel's team made a strong opening offer. I had done my homework. Comparable sales, current lease income, projected appreciation, the specific value of that location to a firm trying to expand its South Park Blocks footprint. I knew the building better than they did. I'd walked it twice with Walt Deering, who had managed it since my grandfather bought it in 2003. I made a counteroffer. We went back and forth with the kind of precision that has nothing to do with charm, and everything to do with preparation. At one point, Daniel looked at me across the table and said, with what seemed like genuine respect, "You know this portfolio very well." My grandfather taught me to pay attention to things, I said. I've been paying attention for a while. We didn't close a deal that day, but we established a framework, and both parties left with something to think about. As Daniel and I rode the elevator down together, his acquisition director had gone ahead. He said, quietly, that he hadn't known about the estate, about my role in it. Claire doesn't know either, I said. No one in my family does, except my parents, and I told them only recently. He absorbed that. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I owe you an apology. For the dinner. I looked at him. You didn't make that decision. No, he said. But I didn't question it. The elevator opened and we walked out into the lobby, and I thought about how much I respected that small, honest sentence. I didn't say anything else about it. Some things don't need a response. The call from my mother came 2 days later. Her voice had the tight, high-pitched quality of someone who has recently learned something that has rearranged the floor beneath them. Daniel had told Claire. Claire, apparently, had not reacted well. Not to the information itself, but to the specific geometry of it. That the sister she'd had quietly removed from the guest list was now the person her fiancé needed a business relationship with, that the woman she'd described to Daniel's mother as sweet but not really our crowd, was Raymond Earl Mitchell's chosen executor and the controlling stakeholder in an $8.7 million real estate portfolio. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked. And underneath the question was the part she wasn't saying: "We would have treated you differently." I let the silence sit for a moment. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked. She didn't answer, which was an answer. I told my mother, calmly and without drama, that I thought we should have a conversation as a family. Not immediately. Not while everyone's emotions were running high. In a few weeks, when things had settled, I suggested Sunday dinner at my place with my parents and Claire. Daniel was welcome too, if Claire wanted that. My mother agreed, in the subdued voice of someone who has just realized they've been misreading a map for a very long time. What I did in the days before that dinner was something my grandfather had done his entire adult life. I prepared carefully and I told the truth. I called Gerald Park and asked him to prepare a summary document, not formal legal paperwork, just a plain language overview of the estate structure, Ridgeline Holdings, the forfeiture provision, and the current status of each asset. I wanted my family to understand what they were looking at, not as a weapon, as information they should have had a long time ago. I also called Walt Deering, who had worked alongside my grandfather for 31 years, and who had, at my request, kept quiet about the estate ever since the will was executed. Walt was in his mid-60s, blunt, and deeply loyal to my grandfather's memory. He offered to come to the dinner. I told him it wasn't necessary but that I'd let him know how it went. He said, "Ray would be proud of how you're handling this." I sat in my van for a few minutes after that call, not doing anything in particular. The Sunday dinner was at my house, which is small and clean and has good light in the evenings. I made my grandfather's pot roast from his handwritten recipe card, the one he taught me on winter Sundays when I was 12. My mother arrived first, bringing a bottle of wine she didn't open until I offered to. My father came in behind her, looking like a man walking into an appointment he'd agreed to before fully understanding what it was for. Claire arrived with Daniel. She walked in without meeting my eyes, which told me everything about where she was emotionally. Daniel shook my hand and said hello in the tone of someone trying to show they are on nobody's side. We ate first. That was deliberate. I've found that people argue less effectively when they're not hungry, and I wanted this to be a conversation, not a confrontation. After dinner, I brought out the folder. I walked them through it quietly: the properties, the LLC, the trust structure, my grandfather's instructions, the timeline of how he'd built what he built over 40 years of work that nobody in the family had thought to ask about. I watched my father's face do something complicated when he saw the appraisal figures. I watched my mother look at her hands. I watched Claire stare at a point somewhere above the table. Then I read them the forfeiture provision, all of it, including the language about deliberate exclusion from family gatherings on the basis of occupation, income, or social standing. I read it in my normal voice, not dramatically, just clearly. Daniel was the first to speak. He said, "The rehearsal dinner." I nodded. Claire said, "Sarah," and then stopped. I waited. "I didn't know about any of this," she said. And then, more quietly, that isn't why I did it. I didn't do it because of money." "I know," I said. "That's actually the part that matters." She looked at me then, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. She said, "I was embarrassed by you." I'm ashamed that I was, but I was. There was something in that honesty that I hadn't expected to feel grateful for. It would have been easier, in a way, if she'd been calculating. Calculated people are simple to understand. Claire was just afraid of what other people thought, in the deep structural way that some people are. The way it gets into the wiring before you're old enough to examine it. "I know that too," I said. Gerald Park had advised me, carefully and without pressure, that the forfeiture provision, if triggered, would be a legal determination. The rehearsal dinner, documented as it was, would constitute a clear case. Claire's 38% stake in Ridgeline, worth approximately $3.3 million, would transfer to the Vocational Scholarship Fund. He said it was my decision entirely and that he would support whatever I chose. I had decided before the dinner started. I told Claire that I was not going to pursue the forfeiture clause, not because the clause wasn't valid, and not because what she'd done hadn't hurt me, but because Grandpa Ray had set up the scholarship fund because he believed in giving people the chance to build something real, and I didn't think he'd meant it as a punishment. He'd meant it as a deterrent. Claire had already lost something that wasn't in any legal document. The fiction she'd been telling herself about what our family was and who I was in it. That, I thought, was the reckoning he'd actually intended. I did tell her that the provision remained in the trust, permanently, and that any future conduct of the same kind would be evaluated by Gerald Park on its merits. She nodded. She didn't look relieved so much as chastened, which felt right. There was a long quiet after that. The kind that happens when a family has arrived somewhere new, and everyone is still figuring out what the new place looks like. My mother said, eventually, that she wished she'd known my grandfather better. She meant it as something about him, but it landed as something about me, and I think she knew that. My father cleared the plates without being asked. Standing at my kitchen sink with his back to the room, he said in a low voice, "Your grandfather told me once that you were the one who actually listened to him. I thought it was an old man's preference." He turned around. His eyes were red in the way men's eyes get when they've decided crying is too much. But something has to show. "I owe you an apology that's going to take longer than tonight." I told him tonight was fine to start. In the months after that dinner, things changed in the incremental, unglamorous way that real things change. My mother started asking about my work, not with the polite vacancy of someone performing interest, but with actual questions. What was the most complicated job I'd done recently? What did I like about working commercial versus residential? She came to see a renovation project I was doing on a historic building in northeast Portland, a full electrical overhaul on a 1940s structure, and she stood in the finished space and said, quietly, "You did this." Not as a question, as something she was taking in. Claire and Daniel got married. I was at the wedding, seated at a table with good sightlines to the dance floor. I wore the steel-toed boots I'd bought with my first paycheck as a licensed electrician, polished for the occasion, because I've never owned a pair of heels and I wasn't about to start for anyone. Nobody commented on the boots. Daniel danced with me at one point, briefly, and he said, "For what it's worth, the partnership on the South Park Blocks acquisition has been the cleanest negotiation I've had in years." I told him I'd gotten my preparation habits from an old contractor who believed that if you understood a thing completely, the right decision usually made itself. We closed the deal 4 months after the wedding. I kept a portion of the proceeds for myself, enough to buy a small house with a proper workshop in the backyard, and reinvested the rest into the portfolio under Gerald's guidance. Walt Deering stayed on as property manager. The scholarship fund received its first 3 recipients that fall: a 19-year-old learning HVAC in Salem, a 24-year-old finishing her welding certification in Eugene, and a 31-year-old single mother completing her electrician's apprenticeship in Portland. I went to the award reception. I sat in a folding chair in a community college conference room and watched those 3 people stand up to be recognized. And I thought about my grandfather at my certification ceremony, the only person from my family who'd shown up, clapping with both hands in the second row. I still work as an electrician. People ask me sometimes why I don't just retire or do something different now that there's money. I tell them the same thing every time. I like knowing how things work. I like tracing a problem back to its source. I like restoring the power when something has gone dark. The boots are still steel-toed. I keep Grandpa Ray's recipe card on my refrigerator, the one with his handwriting across the top in blue ballpoint. Pot roast for hard days. Some Sunday evenings, when the light is good and the work week is done, I make it and eat it alone at the table and tell him about the week. I tell him about the jobs and the negotiations and the scholarship recipients and the slow, ongoing business of my family learning to see me. I tell him it's going better than I expected, which is what he told me it would. "People surprise you," he used to say, "when you give them accurate information and enough time." He was right. He usually was. Here's what I know now, at 29. with my grandfather's boots of a different kind, and my grandfather's patience and my grandfather's unshakable belief that the work you do with your hands is not less than the work done in a boardroom. It is simply different. And difference is not a hierarchy, it's just the shape of a thing. My family tried to make me smaller so that Claire could seem bigger. And that's a story as old as families themselves. But it's not the only story. The other story, the one worth telling, is about the woman who shows up every Sunday, who fixes what's broken, who pays attention to things, who keeps the documents in order, and the connections live, and the power running when everyone else has walked away. That story doesn't require anyone's permission to be true. It just requires showing up, especially when nobody's watching, especially then. Thank you for listening. This is Sarah Mitchell, reminding you that your value was never in your job title or your zip code or your seat at someone else's table. Your grandfather, or whoever it was that saw you clearly when no one else bothered to look, they were right about you. Stand in that. Even in steel-toed boots, especially in steel-toed boots.